Order. Welcome to today's session, which is on the impact of industrial action on university students. And we'll be taking oral evidence from two panels this morning. The first panel is Professor Karen O'Brien, Vice-Chancellor of Durham University, Professor Adam Fagan, Vice President of Education and Student Success at King's College London, and Professor Stuart Elborn joining us down the line, the Provost and Deputy Vice-Chancellor at Queen's University, Belfast. You're all very welcome. Could I perhaps ask each of you to provide a brief overview of how your university was affected by last year's marking and assessment boycott and the action that the university took in response? And perhaps start with Professor O'Brien.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you for inviting me here. It's a pleasure to be here and to talk about an issue that is so important to us and to our students. And I think I can honestly say that there was a significant impact on Durham students, and an impact on one student is one too many. So we were very concerned and very empathetic with our students as they went through this marking and assessment boycott. Just to give you a little bit of context, Durham University has a very backloaded approach to assessments. So final year, a lot of the assessments go in that last period with lots of projects, lots of exams. A lot of universities have 2 exam periods a year, one in January, one in the summer. We only have one. So we knew in advance that the marking and assessment boycott was likely to affect us quite significantly. About 18% of our staff took part. Those staff were very concentrated in particular departments. So proactively, we looked very closely at our academic processes and also at the communications and support we could put in place for students, and we took a very active management approach. On the academic side, we were clearly mindful that we had to maintain quality and standards in our degrees while maximising the certainty we could give students about when they would get their degrees and their marks if they were continuing students. We relied on regulations that we have that allow us to classify students if they have about 75% of their marks or also of their credits, and we were able to offer either full degrees, guaranteed minimum classifications or guaranteed awards to about 80% of our students in that summer period. So that left us with 20% of our students with not enough credits or marks for a guaranteed award or degree. So clearly we had to be very active in terms of trying to persuade and talk to our staff and persuade them to return to marking during the summer.
Right, can I just ask, on a point of clarification around that, you mentioned it's about 18% of your staff who were on strike, and you then referred to 80% who had the mark. Was it all of your students who went through that process, or was it only those students who were affected by staff being on strike and not being able to get marked?
Well, I think it's fair to say that as in all universities, the marking and assessment boycott had a particular impact on particular departments. So 18% of our overall academic staff, but concentrated in certain departments, that's for sure. So, for example, our business school was entirely unaffected by the marking and assessment boycott. So it was very differentially distributed in a way that we didn't quite know how to predict, but it had differential impacts on different students, and they had different numbers of marks and outcomes as a result. During the summer, we ran a series of supplementary exam boards as marks came in. By August, we had about 13% of our students with no guaranteed degrees. So we were able to whittle that down, but 13% is still very many students. So we made the students a goodwill payment of £500. Not a compensation. They were still entitled to ask for and claim compensation, but a goodwill payment. On the student support side, again, we took a very proactive approach to student support. This is the COVID generation of students. We know that they need support in so many ways. We stood up a dedicated comms team. We sent weekly emails explaining to students what they could expect. We had a website. We responded to individual student emails with the team. We enlisted our student union, who were supportive of us and were not supportive of the marking and assessment boycott, and they were very effective actually at communicating with students. And as you probably know, Durham is distinctive in having 17 colleges, and we very much used our colleges and our college support systems to communicate with and support students. We also established a task force with a named individual at its head who liaised individually with students. We invited all students to contact this person individually if they needed help with liaising with employers, if they were worried about their visas, if they were worried about going on to further study. And through that task force, we individually helped 500 students, both practically and financially. And then finally, on the mental health side, we had already greatly augmented the counselling and mental health support that we provide to students as part of a big project that's been underway. And we did provide a very significantly increased amount of one-to-one counselling. We found that students during this period really did want a lot of one-to-one counselling. That increased tenfold during the period. So we were seeing some impacts and we were providing the support that we could.
Thank you. I think that's useful summary. We'll come back to some of the detail of that. Can I just ask, in terms of the 500 who you mentioned were supported by your task force, how does that number compare to the 13% of students with no degree by the middle of the...
That was £500 to each of those students. So it was a...
No, I think you mentioned that the task force was able to have 500 students.
I don't have that Venn diagram in my head. I could get that information for you, but I would think there would be a lot of intersection between those two groups. A lot of those students were international students who were holding master's places at other universities, but they needed to have their degree in order to progress.
Okay.
We liaised individually with
in terms of what is the total number of students in a year at Durham?
A graduating cohort is 5,000 undergraduates.
Okay, thank you. If I can come to Professor Fagan.
Thank you. Very similar. This was a very, very difficult period for King's College London. I think the stress that students endured was very difficult to watch and observe. We were a slightly different situation. We were able to classify and graduate all of our students who were eligible to do so, both at undergraduate and at postgraduate level. We were able to do that because many of our staff took on additional marking and were very keen to become involved in that in order to mitigate the impact on their students. We also have regulations that allow us to hold examination, for me and my senior colleagues, to hold examination boards where staff involved in action were reluctant to do so or refused to do so. So we were able to make those decisions, which meant that every single student eligible for a degree received a degree when they should have done. We worked incredibly closely with our student union, and placed a great deal of emphasis on communication, because the impact on this generation of students, on their mental health, their absolute, almost paralysis of fear and not being able to move on to the next stage of their life was tangible. And it involved, for example, significant number of emails that I responded to personally, dealing with parents, because of course parents were very, very concerned as well, and in about 150 cases, perhaps a few more, dealing directly with employers and other universities where students had been offered a place at a postgraduate course and the student was anxious, what would happen. We deducted salary from striking staff, and all of that money, all of that resource was deployed to employ additional mental health counsellors, and also to, wherever we could, to provide additional support for students, study sessions, advice on careers and employability. I really have very little to add beyond what Professor O'Brien has said, other than a very similar situation, that I would estimate that about 25% of our students were impacted. Across our 9 faculties, there was only action in 4 of those faculties. But I think it's important to emphasise that where there was action, it was acute, and it had a really significant... So I don't want to in any way give the impression that just because it was 25% of our students, it wasn't devastating for those students and really, really difficult.
Presumably the media focus on coverage on this created concern for students, even if they weren't.
Absolutely. Of course, they were networked with their fellow students in other universities. So even though we continually reassured them that either they would progress for progressing students or they would graduate, they were listening to stories elsewhere, and so we were mitigating an awful lot of that anxiety as well.
I mean, again, we will go through into some of the more detail as we go through the brief, but I just want to touch, obviously, being in London, you probably have a higher proportion of international students than some of the other universities. That cohort, I know, was particularly, there were a number of issues that particularly affected that cohort. The fact that you were able to get everyone classified and awarded presumably would have helped with that, but was there anything additionally that you did to reassure that cohort and work with them?
Absolutely. We had specifically targeted communication because for many international students, it was they couldn't quite grasp the context, the broader context. You know, for the action, remind ourselves, the industrial action had lasted really 5 years. So for many of our home students, they'd observed or they understood that the sector was, you know, in the grip of this long period of action. Whereas a student who's coming in perhaps for a one-year master's from parts of Southeast Asia or elsewhere. So we were very careful to give them a broader context, but also to reassure them that actually we had a grip on this situation and that it was something we were managing.
Thank you. Professor Elborn, can I bring you in from the Queen's University experience?
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation to join this meeting. Quite a number of the interventions that have been described by my two colleagues were very similar in Queen's in terms of really focusing on the student experience, ensuring we did appropriate student support in those schools that were affected. That really was driven by a central critical incident team that met for a large part of the month of May on a daily basis, ensuring that communication was clear to our students. In terms of the effect, one faculty, for example, Medicine, Health and Life Sciences, there was no effect, and it was pretty clear from the beginning of the marking assessment boycott that it would not be impacted. So we really focused our attention on the other two faculties and the schools within those where we saw problems coming. We worked very hard with students, with staff, and also with the unions. We continued a strong dialogue with our UCU colleagues during that time. And I think it's important also to emphasise that we were 4 to 6 weeks ahead of particularly the universities in England. Our educational cycle means that we have our graduations in late June, early July, which is ahead of many of our colleague universities. So the stress and difficulty and challenges to the students and to staff, because the marking assessment boycott was very difficult for staff who were participating and for staff not participating. We were able to get to a position where we were sure that we could get all of our students through graduation, not necessarily with the classification. But during that time, we had, as I think you'll know, quite intense discussions with UCU, and directed by our Senate, our governing body, we came to a resolution to the boycott that allowed us to then proceed with graduations in a completely different atmosphere and culture, and we're able to get all of our students graduated by the end of August, because the UCU staff who were participating in the marking assessment boycott came off that, and we were able to complete all of the marking in August and get exam boards through so that students were able to proceed with their careers in September.
And so we'll come back to that element in a minute. But just in terms of the subject breakdown, would you say that was similar across the piece in terms of which subjects were affected? I know it's obviously a minority of subjects at each university which were affected. Is it broadly arts and humanities more affected and sciences less so, or is it more complicated than that?
In general, although not entirely consistent. So, for example, in addition to many of our arts and humanities subjects, our architecture programme was very challenging, as was psychology, and particularly subjects where there was a professional body involved, that degrees had to be accredited. We spent a lot of time with those professional bodies, ensuring that the students would have the appropriate credits and accreditation so that they could move on in their careers.
And that, I see you're nodding, Professor O'Brien. That's
similar experience and similar constraints with accrediting bodies as well.
Okay, I'll just touch on a little bit more detail. Professor Fagan, you took the approach of reassigning marking to other members of staff. How did you ensure that the work was marked by staff with the appropriate level of subject expertise?
I think that was very challenging, and we were very clear right from the outset that we weren't. That had to be the principle. If you were marking economics work, you had to be an economist. So we were able to manage that within faculties, within departments, within our broader, some of our alumni professors, some of our retired professors who we contacted, but nobody marked work who did not have expertise in that subject area. So, for example, I undertook quite considerable marking, political scientist. I marked final year dissertations. We prioritised final year marking. But it was, in many circumstances, actually it was a more senior person who ended up doing the marking than would otherwise have been the case. So I can say with absolute certainty that the integrity of degrees was upheld, that the work was marked according to our rubrics. It was checked, moderated, second marked in the way it would normally have been done.
And you mentioned that your constitution, your regulations allowed you to do that. Is that something which differs in the Durham example, as though
absolutely
it's a legislative barrier to you being able to take that approach?
It's very interesting to have had the conversation with Professor O'Brien, because I think it appears much more regulated, a different type of system in Durham. We operate still according to the old University of London regulations. It allows us to, for example, look across a student's performance across a degree programme, and if we believe that if there is evidence of learning objectives having been met, we are able to condone certain marks. So we operated within our existing rules, our normal regulations. There is also no prescription as to who should mark work. There is no prescription as to how constituting emergency exam awarding, degree awarding bodies. It's all permissible within our regulations. So 90% of our students, our graduating cohort, were classified according to our normal regulations.
Okay, thank you. And then in your case, Professor O'Brien, you took the approach of giving students interim classifications based on marks that were already available.
We did, yes.
When the marks did then come through, the full marks, how different were they? How consistent was that approach?
And that's a very good question, a question we asked ourselves prospectively, because we gave interim classifications on a no detriment basis, because clearly you're not going to tell someone that they've got a first and then more marks come in and they have a 2-1. So we ran a statistical model. We raised the bar a little bit on what it takes to get a first or a 2-1. And then we went through a very thorough exercise. We graduated our students on the basis of them having all their marks, so interim with not all marks, and then final classifications with all their marks. We ran a statistical exercise which we shared with our Senate and our external examiners, and it was accurate to the extent of 99.7%. So we were very fortunate in being supported by an excellent statistician, and we have a lot of confidence that those interim classifications were in the end the same as the real ones.
But that only applied to 87% of the students.
That's right. Yes.
Time for graduation.
Right,
so
yes.
there were those who.
That's right, because there were those remaining students for whom we weren't able to find reassigned markers and who were undoubtedly in limbo during the course of the summer.
Fleck, I'll bring you in.
Brilliant, thank you. Just want to go into the process at Queen's University. Professor Elborn, I mean, you were able to end the marking and assessment boycott early to reach a local agreement with the University and College Union. Can you outline the process in more detail and explain why you took this approach?
Yes, we, as I mentioned earlier, we were already in full sail in terms of interacting with our students, with our staff, and with UCU in early May when this was coming, and I guess the stress on students particularly, but also on staff, was gathering. We were able to. We used a slightly different approach in terms of authenticating and making sure that we were maintaining the quality of degree, in that we used the number of credits to get to a unclassified degree, and a number of our students graduated with that, but then subsequently had their classification identified. So we were meeting regularly. We agreed after a number of very engaged discussions, particularly with our students. They protested on a number of occasions. We actually went out and met them with some of the union representatives. And the student voice within this, both on the union and on ourselves, really intensified the need for us, we felt, to find a resolution to this because of the impact it was having, particularly on the students. So after a number of very difficult negotiations, but being pragmatic with our colleagues in UCU, we felt that coming to a determination of an offer that would allow them to move off the marking and assessment boycott, but would be realistic and allow us to realign with UCU and UCEA in the future was the best solution that we could find for our students at that point. So we made the offer of a 2% increase, mortgaged against whatever the increase would be in the following year, backdated until April of that year, and agreed to repay any money that had been deducted from those union members who had taken part in the marking and assessment boycott, if they would go back and ensure that all of the student scripts, projects, exhibitions, etc. were marked and would allow us to have full classified graduation by the end of August.
Okay, because I think that led to some disagreement with the University and College Employers Association, who said it's an extremely serious matter incompatible with the continued membership of UCEA.
Yes.
So what's the implications for the university and for the students then? And how's it going to affect you if there's any further industrial action?
So we're currently suspended from UCEA for 3 years, although we've kept open channels for discussion around other aspects of UCEA's activities. It's not just collective bargaining that UCEA lead, but there's issues around pensions, health and safety, etc. So we're keeping those discussion lines open, but we are not allowed to participate in UCEA activities for 3 years, although it may be that the board of UCEA might reconsider that over the next year or so.
And what impact do you see then on the staff on it? Or do you think that, I mean, do you need to have membership of UCEA then?
We would prefer to be members of UCEA. The situation, though, is that we're now moving into bargaining locally with UCU in the coming year. We've taken advice from particularly Imperial College, who already have an arrangement with UCEA where they do their local bargaining not as part of the collective bargaining, and learning from other universities who have other variations. We will proceed on the basis that we would like, where possible, to keep as aligned as we can to the collective bargaining that is agreed with UCEA and UCU. But this does give us some flexibility over the next period of time that we're outside of UCEA to come to some local solutions, which is quite important because the itchy sector in Northern Ireland, as it is in the devolved nations, is not the same as in England. There are differences in how that is organised, funded, etc. I think one of the challenges we felt was that UCEA was essentially being driven by the situation in the English universities. We were ahead of that by, as I said, 4 to 6 weeks. And we had different pressures and stresses in Northern Ireland with being actually relatively close to government. Government wasn't sitting at the time, but with civil servants, with parents. It's a smaller community, and the pressure around this was really quite intense on students and staff.
Can I just ask, in that context and on that basis, how different was the approach that Queen's took to that of Ulster University, or was Ulster University not engaged in this?
Yeah, no, Ulster had challenges with the marking and assessment boycott. I think you probably need to ask them what the details of those were, but they were managing it in a range of ways with external marking, and they were also using statistical modelling, as I understand, but I'm not party to the details of their approach, but they had issues with marking and assessment boycott in Ulster.
And have they stayed affiliated with, have they stayed aligned with UCEA in
Yes.
terms of collective bargaining?
Yes, they have.
Okay. And so obviously, I mean, the point that UCEA made to us in their evidence was that they argued that both the unions and the universities are clearly committed to collective bargaining, and that is actually supported by the unions. So it was obviously a pretty substantial decision that was taken to depart from that in Queen's case. You set out some of the context for that, but do you just want to add anything in terms of why not stick to collective bargaining in these circumstances?
Well, we felt that this time difference in terms of our process being 4 to 6 weeks ahead of particularly the English universities, there was some sense that there may be some resolution found over the next 6 weeks, but that was going to come too late for us and for our students. And in consultation with our senior executive team and our governing body, we felt we needed to make an offer that would be acceptable to our colleagues in the union to really move this forward for the sake of the students. So we took the decision to move forward with this offer, I guess hoping to some extent that UCEA would understand that position, but as it turned out, the board then decided that we had sufficiently deviated from collective bargaining in the agreement that we made, that would have a consequence for us.
Okay. So just moving on then with communications of students, this is to all the panel. I mean, much of the evidence that's been received by the committee suggests that communications between students and universities was poor, with students dissatisfied with the frequency and detail of the information provided by the university. And you sort of touched on what you did, but I just wonder if you could go into a bit more detail. Particularly, I think, so we talked about, someone talked about task force to help students. Was that you, Professor?
Yes, it was, yes.
Can we just find out a little bit more about how that actually worked and how the students perceived it?
I'm happy to speak to that. I obviously, it's a matter of regret if any students don't feel that they were communicated with in a way that worked for them and that they felt was frequent enough. But I can honestly say that we took a very proactive approach to communications. We had weekly emails setting out the situation, both for continuing students who are another group affected by the marking assessment boycott, and clearly for finalists. We have a regularly updated website. We had communications using some of our student channels. I had regular meetings with the presidents of the JCRs in the colleges, because they themselves are, I think students trust communications from other students, and they themselves are very proactive in the way that they communicate and support students. And we did repeatedly invite students to contact a named individual, our equivalent of Adam, our PVC education, and we set up a task force of individuals, including this named individual, who would deal with individual queries, because in the end I think what really matters to students is that they understand that we see them as individuals with individual needs, individual stresses and strains, and everybody's predicament is different. So I honestly think we did the absolute best that we could. I think always in a large organisation you get some areas that don't completely join up, and you get some individuals. I think particularly because the finalist students had gone home, they weren't on campus. We did try QR codes in the library, we made videos, we tried a whole range of ways of reaching them, but some of them were off campus, and perhaps that didn't always help them feel connected to the university.
And I think one of the biggest criticisms with Durham that the results didn't come out to September. We've got here, later confirmed they were unable to provide a definitive date as to when the students received their full results, which are later confirmed in September. And in an article in the Telegraph, students at Durham University criticised the university for not having a clear plan, and their communications were missing the point. I mean, I know one of our colleagues was had a daughter at Durham who...
Yes, I've spoken to your
Yeah,
colleague.
who missed the fast track for the civil service.
Yes.
I'm sure she has.
And I spoke to many parents besides, I
Okay.
should say. As Adam said, we also had contacts from parents. Well, I think, there were many students where we had a degree of certainty, interim guaranteed awards, and we were able to say to them that the marking and assessment boycott would come to an end. It had a fixed term. It was due to come to an end in September. So we had that certainty about when staff would be obliged to return to marking. But in terms of that 13% of students that I mentioned to you, it is true that before the end of that period, it was very hard for us to say definitively when we would get their degrees if it were earlier. But as soon as the marking and assessment boycott ended, which was on the 7th of September, we wrote to all students and we gave them a definitive date by which they would get their degrees, and we stuck to it.
Because it sounds like every university did it slightly differently. So King's, I think, you said that you gave them, you were able to classify them early because you brought in other people to mark.
We classified them on time. We didn't do it early. We did it absolutely, yes. With regard to the communication, I think we've always got lessons to learn. I think it was very, very challenging. These were incredibly testing circumstances. I think one of the difficulties we faced was striking a balance between not spreading fear and anxiety amongst, 75% of our students were unaffected. So we used local channels, bespoke channels. We worked with our student union, but actually often we were in a situation where we were second-guessing the behaviour of our colleagues and the union nationally. We were keeping a very close eye on the negotiations. So we found ourselves in a situation that we had no updated information to pass on to students. So actually just reiterating the same reassuring messages in different ways and responding to particular anxieties, I think probably for some students fell short of what they would have hoped for. But I honestly feel it was probably the best we could do under the circumstances. I think visibility was the key thing, and my senior colleagues and I made ourselves available at every possible opportunity to meet students and to talk to them and to try to give those messages of reassurance. We were in a fortunate position that we were able to say with quite a high degree of confidence that we would be able to, that they would graduate and that we would be able to classify them and so that they could attend graduation.
Yeah, I think one of the criticisms of King's College was the focus, and actually I've heard this from the other panellists too, was the focus on emotional support rather than tangible measures as to when the university put in place the mitigation effects of the boycott and when they were going to get their results. I think that uncertainty, and it's great that you put mental health help in, but they wanted to know dates and wanted to, some sort of a surety of when they were going to get their results so they could move on. You have sort of mentioned that before. But
if I may, I think the challenge again was that we were doing this, we were balancing difficult industrial relations, obviously, but we were very keen not to give false hope. I think we were pretty confident that we knew the dates and we knew that we could stick to our schedule, particularly for final year students. It was different for our continuing students because we were very clear to them that our finalists were our priority. The continuing students would have their work marked, but it would be late. We couldn't guarantee when they would get their marks. But what we said to them was, you will be able to progress. You will be able to come back in September and continue your degree. Do not worry. But you might not have your marks until the start of the next academic session, because we are prioritising getting all the work marked for final year students. I think we also were in a very difficult relationship with striking colleagues, that if we were too robust in our assertions, we did not want to deliberately provoke tensions. We were, travelling a very careful line. So sometimes it was easier to not emphasise dates and specificity whilst we were doing things in the background.
Just in case you missed them, I suppose.
Exactly.
Yeah, but I think
it was we didn't want to inflame the political tensions unduly because that would have had a devastating impact on students. Yeah. We were very keen. So I take your point about mental health. I think mental health perhaps is a bit of a broad term for what we were doing. What we were actually doing was supporting their learning and studying and giving them the advice and guidance. I think in extreme cases, in minority cases where it did accentuate mental health issues for students, obviously we put in additional support. But it was really about welfare and advice.
So, Professor Elborn, you said earlier that you ensured that communication was clear. How did that differ from our other panellists?
I think it was really quite similar. We had a very clear central position with then empowering our heads of school and faculties to have those local conversations with groups and with individuals so that issues were being dealt with at all levels. I echo the challenge of a lot of students weren't affected and we didn't want to make their anxiety worse. And then the students that potentially were affected, it was the uncertainty of what was going to happen and what those dates were and how they would progress in their careers was really very challenging. For me, I think the key bit was having engagement with our students' union, but also with the groups of students affected, having group discussions with students, for example, the architecture students who were particularly affected because in their programme they move in their Masters of Architecture onto sort of employed part of their training. And they were deeply worried about how their careers would progress and doing town hall with them and then following up with individual discussions, I think was really important. Similarly for the international students where visa issues were potentially challenging for them, also parents coming from a long way to graduation, the uncertainties of do we tell our parents not to come at one stage because we might not be graduating. Those were all very difficult and I think had to be handled very sensitively by the staff and the teams that knew them, but with a sense of we had some pathway through this that would bring the reassurance that they needed.
I think
our UCU colleagues also helped us with communication. So I think bringing the students, the management and UCU into rooms to have those conversations and then support the communication was also really helpful for us.
Thank you. Can I bring in Caroline on the point of international students?
Thank you, Chair, and good morning. International students, yes. Home students abroad and postgraduate students. Three particular groups, all deemed to have been particularly affected by the boycott. We have touched on each one in various guises, but I wonder in this moment whether you might focus on those three groups and talk about the sort of provision that you put in place that was specific to the challenges that they faced as individual cohorts within that. Professor Elborn, as you just mentioned international students, I wonder if you might elaborate.
So not dissimilar to the situation in Durham, we made a fund available for financial support because that was something that we could do clearly, and a large number of students did put a very short case forward to if this had an impact.
And that was for international students?
That was for all students, but was particularly helpful for the international students. Many of our home students have access to homes, so they didn't need additional accommodation, whereas that was a much bigger challenge for international and almost by default for some of our postgraduate students because, again, they're enriched with many more international students. So, financial support, that direct communication with their schools and with their tutors, and ensuring that the Students' Union and the student voice beyond the Students' Union was being engaged with, and the schools where there were particular issues that we were really picking those up and dealing with those early so that we didn't...
Those were generally applied provisions rather than specific to these individual groups. I'm just interested in this moment if there was a specific sort of bespoke targeted provision for these three particular groups of students. Perhaps I'll move to Professor O'Brien.
We get pretty general, so that any student with any problem, regardless of their level or whether they were local or international, could avail of the support. The international students, we did have particular advice available around visas, etc., so that if there was any visa issues, we could deal with those. And there were a number of those situations that transpired, which we were able to deal with.
Smashing, thank you. Professor O'Brien.
Yes, so I'll start with international students. You're right, they were a distinct group. They were particularly affected and particularly concerned. At the national level, we got very good support from UKVI. They allowed international students who were planning to do post-study work to have an 8-week sort of additional period during which they would have to present their degree results. The most concerned group of international students were those who are wanting to progress to master's programs. And certainly in Durham's case, there are a lot of students that go on to places like King's. Adam and I were batting emails back and forward all summer about these students. So within that task force that I mentioned offering individual support, we had visa specialists, and we also had a dedicated specialist advice for international students. And we wrote a series of what we called highly likely letters to a number of institutions explaining that these are the marks the student currently has. This is our assessment based on their prior attainment of their likely performance. So if you've given them a conditional offer of a 2-1, we are very confident that they will get a 2-1. And moreover, if they do come and this doesn't work out, we'll refund the fees. So we underwrote a whole variety of things, including accommodation fees. I think it was very low risk because in practice, as far as we're aware, all of our international students progressed to their master's programs, but they did need a lot of dedicated support, and we did work with UUK, who worked with UKVI to sort out the national visa issues. So that, I think, as a join-up, worked extremely well. You mentioned other groups. Postgraduate students, mainly they don't fall within that assessment period. If we'd had a marking and assessment boycott at different points in the year, you'd have seen different universities and different groups of students hit very hard. We mainly don't mark postgraduates during this period, other than our Masters in Social Work students. They can't progress to becoming social workers without degrees. Interim awards wouldn't do. So we spoke to our sociology department and they marked their work. So there was some flexibility exercised by our staff and there was some bespoke work done. I'm sorry, I don't recall you had a third group and I don't recall.
Those are important insights though.
Okay.
It was home students abroad.
Home students abroad, well, those would be mainly students, progressing students, so students on modern language placements or in the politics department. So they were probably largely unaffected because they would have been assessed in Germany or wherever they might happen to be studying elsewhere in the world. So it was important to stay in contact with them. But they, like all progressing students, they were reassured that no matter what, they would progress.
I'll just come back to you on that in a moment when I've heard from Professor Fagan.
Thank you. Yes. For postgraduate students, I think it was very, very challenging. Unlike Durham, their assessment for their work did fall within the MAB period. And I think they're with us for only a year. They've paid high fees, and whether they're home or international. And the big focus was on the next stage of their lives, employers. So we had a letter prepared that could be adapted very easily, that they could supply to employers or for internships. We also, in a number of cases, I think I've said already, we work directly with employers in order to really make it clear what the university's position was and what we predicted would happen. If I may just focus on the undergraduate, there was one particular group that I was concerned about throughout. We have a very large percentage of students from what we call broadly widening participation backgrounds, first in their family to come to university. And my concern and my colleagues' concern throughout was disengagement. Their first experience of university was, this disruption, missed learning, work not being marked, not getting feedback. So I think that for us was a big challenge, and particularly in London where students live quite far from campus, and if they weren't coming onto campus, and how do we make sure that they simply are not lost in this process. So I think our circumstances, we've got a very large postgraduate population, 40% of our students postgraduate, but then we also have this large number of undergraduates from particular backgrounds.
So on that, in terms of the widening participation cohort, not to want to pigeonhole everybody, I just wanted to sort of road test what was said by Chief Exec it was of UCEA, who said that international students, postgraduate and final year students had received a disproportionate profile in terms of the visibility of the issues affecting them. Does that suggest then that actually the impact was felt quite profoundly by other groups, such as those coming from widening participation? Bearing in mind I asked that question, exactly that question, so clearly felt international students were important in the mix, but has that rather clouded other groups who could be as
not in our
impacted?
case. I mean, look, we were very clear that all our students were affected. You know, the students who were affected, they were all affected, and obviously the differences in terms of the impact had to be anticipated, and we responded to that. But I think in my comments perhaps suggest that we weren't just focusing on international students. Yes, of course, they are paying higher fees. They're facing different challenges studying in London and unfamiliar perhaps with the sector. But it's also the case that students who, were home students, as I say, from whether it's WP background or not, these are 18, 19-year-olds who, are barely adults.
The same visibility, the same profile in terms of understanding the impact of the boycott.
I think yes, there were very, very similar difficulties, and I think the messaging had to be nuanced in such a way, and that was one of the big challenges we faced. We do not have a remotely homogenous community, and therefore any messaging has to be nuanced, and we have to do everything we can to try to make sure that we're reaching different audiences.
Thank you. Anna.
Thank you, Chair. So we've heard a lot of evidence as part of this inquiry about the effect on students' mental health of this very difficult period, which I don't think you disagree with. And some of the evidence has been that the help and support was more focused on trying to get the students their degrees or help them with the next stage than actually on the anxiety that it was causing them at the time, which I can also understand. So what I'd like to know is what was the specific mental health support that you offered, and more importantly, what was the feedback you have received, and more importantly than that, what have you learned during this period to avoid students having such a terrible experience should this happen again? What can you do better?
Do you want to start with
Thank
me?
you, Professor
O'Brien. Well, I would absolutely say very strongly that mental health support was front and centre in our thinking about our students. It is generally, we're going through a process of mental health charter accreditation as a sector, and I think generally we're thinking a great deal more about that, and we'd already made a very significant investment in mental health support at Durham, and we take it very seriously. The most important thing that we had to say to our finalists, because remember that a lot of them had left campus, was that, despite the fact that you've been to your graduation or, in some cases, celebration ceremony and you're no longer with us, you still have full right of access to all of our support services. In our case, that includes very bespoke support from our colleges. We use our 17 colleges who know our students individually very well as key planks in our support architecture, and they, including widening participation students in the way that Adam mentioned. And we have tracked the numbers, and we've looked at the numbers of students last year accessing general student welfare support, so the wellbeing and welfare support, compared to previous years. And it didn't go up significantly, but nevertheless, those were COVID years as well. So we have a general situation in which students are accessing support services more than they used to. We did also significantly increase the number of counselling one-to-one sessions available, and there, as I mentioned, last academic year, we saw a 10-fold increase in the uptake of those sessions. Now, we can't be sure that those are entirely around the marking and assessment boycott, because clearly we can't ask, but going for a 10-fold increase suggests to me some kind of cause or correlation between these two things. And again, it's very difficult to elicit feedback because we want to know that students access those services.
We have a national student survey running at the moment. We'll get some feedback, particularly in the qualitative comments that students make about how they felt about the support that they got if they're continuing students. And we're clearly talking extensively to our student union and our student reps in colleges about the support that we provide. I think the message is that it's good, that it's very well received, but we can never entirely meet the scale of the demand, and that's the reality of contemporary higher education, but we continue to invest in that area.
What I understand, of course, you can't get feedback on the actual support because that would probably reveal confidential issues, but you can certainly get feedback from students on the support they were actually offered and whether it was helpful. And how much feedback have you got, and what does it tell you?
We've got a certain amount of feedback in student support services. It's uniformly very positive. We gathered that up as part of our mental health charter submission, and we recently had our accreditation visit. So it will be interesting to hear what the visit comes out with, actually, because that's an independent assessment of the support that we provide. But we generally get positive feedback from our students about the support that we provide.
What are the lessons learned for the future? Because some students, as we know, it meant that they couldn't actually take up the job that they were hoping to take up because they had to make applications that it required them to put their degree down. The civil service was one such example. So are you making, in case this should happen again, have you made contacts with organisations like that to try and ensure, if this were to happen again, they would accept your recommendation of what the degree might be?
Well, in terms of employers, we were in contact with a lot of big employers. We all were across the sector, and mostly we found, particularly the big international employers, the UK employers, were very understanding. My understanding was for the civil service exam, there was a willingness to defer the requirement to present a degree transcript. So most employers who understand the UK or who work internationally within the UK were very flexible and very understanding. It was a little bit more challenging when we were writing to employers in other countries who had little understanding of what the UK was like. And clearly, if students have lost job opportunities for reasons like that, we were very clear, we have to be very clear with students that they have a right to complain. We told them in every communication how they could complain. And in some cases, we have compensated students financially. Now, that doesn't entirely compensate for the distress and inconvenience, but a financial compensation for potential loss of earnings is what we have offered students.
Thank you.
Thank you. We invested considerably in additional support for mental health and welfare, 1.5, somewhere in the region of 1.5 million during that period. I think the evidence is difficult to disentangle because when we looked at the data, the qualitative data on when students were presenting to mental health services, whether they mentioned the marking assessment boycott, whether they mentioned industrial action, it was a very, very few cases where that was so. However, our approach was, whether they'd mentioned it or not, we needed to put this additional resource in place. It is different because, as I've said throughout, we were able to say with some confidence that they were going to graduate and they were not going to miss the opportunity of employment and all the rest of it. But nevertheless, they didn't always hear that, so we kept having to reinforce it. I think what it's made us realise, I mean, we understood this already, but I think it's what it's really augmented is, this was feedback not being given. It's the feedback moment is the point of contact in a large, multidisciplinary university. It's that interaction if you take that away, it's that disengagement and it's the lack of contact. So actually, it's the tutor, it's the academic who gives feedback and notices a student is clearly not well or not perhaps hasn't turned up, and that so that coming out of the equation was really problematic. So what we did within departments was make sure that where there were staff who were not involved in the action, and even in the most affected departments, there were always staff who had made it very clear that they were not participating. Heads of department did everything where they could to make sure additional resources. So, for example, general feedback sessions. we engaged some of our teaching assistants to offer additional sessions. So students at least had opportunities to check in and make sure. So I think it goes back to that differentiation between what is mental health and what is just making sure that the support network's in place.
I'm going to have to ask for shorter answers, I'm afraid, because we're going to run out of time for this panel. But
no, I was going to say, Professor Elborn, anything to add?
Yes, I just a couple of points. One, this cohort of students had been impacted by the pandemic, and I think that has to be recognised in how we not just got them through this process, but it may have longer term implications for them. I think the points that my colleagues have made, I would absolutely support. But I think a lot of this comes down to we have to deal with individuals, and while it's great having principles, often the solution or the help or support was dealing with the person at an individual level, and that was a combination of staff from their course, but also the support of our student and wellbeing services across universities, which I think we've all invested considerably in to deal with the broader issues that young people are facing, and also the impact of COVID, and for those students who were affected by, for example, the marking and assessment boycott, to ensure that they're in the best place possible to move on with their careers, whether that's continuing in education or moving on to employers. And just to say, we had a very good experience working with employers. PwC, who have a big presence in Northern Ireland, for example, helped and led with us a way of ensuring that no person who'd been in the application process or been offered by PwC and the other larger firms in that sector would be negatively impacted by not having their degree classification. So I think
that's
dealing
helpful.
Thank you.
We're going to have to move the session on because we're going to run out of time. Nick, can I bring you in?
Yeah, thank you. It's Professor O'Brien. Thank you all for attending today. It's really interesting to hear what you've got to say. You offered a £500 goodwill payment to final year students by the boycott. How did you communicate that with the students? Was it successful, what you did there?
Well, we wrote all the affected students a letter, and that was a successful communication. You won't be surprised to hear, and it was appreciated. We do understand that £500, it was a goodwill gesture. Some of those students also did get formal compensation if they had losses as well. So we didn't think that would be the end of it. But of course, it was well received, and it's our way of saying that we were sorry that this was continuing and that we had empathy for students, and we recognise that there are costs associated with waiting for your degree throughout a summer.
Was that offered to postgraduate students and international students too? Or?
Well, as I said earlier, our postgraduate students were not affected, other than probably some, we haven't mentioned postgraduate research students who may or may not have had their vivas. And international, we have some international undergraduates, mainly home undergraduates at Durham, and clearly that was offered to all of them on an equal basis.
Yeah, and did they all accept it? Did it
yes, they did.
Yes, everybody, very good.
Quite reasonably,
yes. Thank you for that. Professor Fagan, did you? I don't believe you did offer that. Was there a reason why you didn't offer it? Is it because you thought you managed to get all the
yes,
all the exams?
I mean, had we certainly discussed internally, if we had been in a situation where we wouldn't have been able to graduate students, we would have done something very similar to what Durham were doing. But we were able. We didn't need to in the end.
Yeah. No, thank you for that. I want to go back to something that you said earlier. You said that business schools completely unaffected.
Yes.
Why was that? Was it just
well, I think it's probably true in almost all universities. There are these subject profiles. There are different levels of union membership and activity in different subject areas. And I think in common with nearly all universities, business schools tend not to be highly active in these spaces. And so our business school students, undergraduates, were unaffected by the marking and assessment boycott.
Okay, right. Thank you. That's me done.
Thank you very much, Andrew.
Thank you. So to ask all three of you what communications you had with the Office for Students during the boycott, how you'd assess OFS's response, and what you feel OFS could usefully contribute, if anything, which is a valid answer, in terms of the future impacts to students. Start with you, Adam.
I just want to say that I felt the communication from OFS was very helpful indeed. The clarity with which they pointed out and reminded the sector that we needed to graduate our students, classify our students, and we needed to maintain the integrity of degrees.
Why did you need reminding of that?
We didn't. It wasn't that we needed reminding, because that was absolutely what was guiding our principles. I think some of our staff who were involved in the action needed reminding. And we were reminding them regularly, but to have the backing of the Office for Students, I think was very, very important. And I think it also helped us in reminding some of our students who perhaps were more sympathetic to the action and not as understanding of the situation. I think it was really good for the sector as a whole, and for us as a university to have those two principles reinforced at regular intervals, and we were very grateful for that.
Thank you.
So yes, we received a letter Adam is alluding to, a letter we received from the OFS reminding us to maintain quality and standards while doing our best to mitigate the impacts of the strike and graduate our students as soon as possible. Of course, we didn't need reminding, but it was quite helpful with our governors. We all have trustee bodies. They are accountable, as I am as a Vice-Chancellor, to the OFS. So it wasn't unhelpful. They also provided some quite helpful guidance to students. We made regular reports to the OFS, we all did throughout the period. They professed themselves satisfied with Durham's approach. Nevertheless, I would say that I would have welcomed a more proactive response from the OFS. I think there's more that they could do to help at least share information and provide guidance. I think under circumstances like these, being able to say to students, but also to staff, we entirely sympathise. You have a legitimate right to take industrial action. We sympathise with what you feel about the payoff you've been made. Nevertheless, we have clear obligations under the Higher Education and Research Act to protect the student interest, and this is why we're doing what we're doing. And I think a more active approach from the OFS would have been welcome. And I think in future, they could look at the kinds of emergency regulations. You're hearing quite a diversity of response based on quite a diversity of regulations and assessment patterns. I think there could be a role for the OFS in looking more prospectively at what we do in emergencies, because clearly industrial action is one kind of emergency, but we all know that there are other kinds of emergencies that come along, and I would be quite happy for them to play that role, and that's a legitimate role for the OFS.
Thank you, Stuart.
Thank you. We don't have a direct relationship with the Office for Students. It's indirectly through our Department of Economy, which is our reporting body. I think we found the communication in general helpful, but just to pick up on the issue of integrity and quality, it was our students who reminded us how important that was to them, and that they didn't want compromise in marking, because the confidence in the quality of the degree that they were being awarded was paramount. And so that was a very useful part of our negotiating, that we could feed that back to our colleagues on staff and in the unions, that this was really important for our students.
Thank you, Stuart.
Thank you. And just very briefly, in the Northern Irish context, do you think there was a difference in the support and approach you got because of the absence of ministers, or actually was the relationship with the Department of the Economy strong enough that you didn't really need ministers there in order to have those conversations?
I think it would have been helped by having ministers. We didn't have a lot of intervention from the Department of Economy. We kept them in close communication, and they supported the actions that we were proposing, but there wasn't much directive intervention, which might have been different if we had had a minister in place.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Mohammed.
Yeah, thank you so much. Some evidence submitted to this inquiry criticised the minister approach, saying that minister intervention was late, baseless rhetoric, and inadequate. And the absence of the coordinated and proactive approach has left students feeling neglected. So how satisfied you are with the government's response to the industrial action? Professor Fagan, can I start with you, please?
I think it's a difficult question because we also had a local dispute that focused very specifically on particular aspects of our package to staff. So we certainly, quite a great deal of our focus was on that. We have put in place a number of measures to do with parental leave and a variety of other things that have satisfied the demands of our local branch of the union. So that was one of our foci. In terms of the national negotiations, national dispute, and the way that the dispute was resolved, look, I think we recognised throughout, as a leadership of the university, that this was very difficult in the current economic climate. I think there was also a huge recognition, a significant recognition that there was industrial action taking place in the health sector and amongst school teachers, and therefore, what was happening in those sectors clearly was important context in terms of the dispute. But beyond that, I really don't feel in a position to comment, because I think much of our focus, as I say, was on students and managing this situation. We were just very, very relieved that the action came to an end after such a long period of time.
The Department for Education, in their written evidence submission, are very clear, as is the case, that universities are autonomous institutions. So it is our responsibility, as regulated by the OFS, which again is at arm's length from the Department for Education, to do the best we can and do what we know we need to do. Nevertheless, the DFE did take a legitimate interest in something that's so consequential for students. I think the wider context that I particularly welcome has been the focus of the DFE in the recent years on mental health more broadly for students, because that's part of the ongoing work that we do with them, with their champion for student welfare and mental health, a fellow Vice-Chancellor, and we do that work together. Whether it would have helped to have been sort of asked to come and meet or to talk, I can't really say, but I'm not sure that there were any specific interventions which would have led us to do things differently. I think we did the very best that we could in, frankly, very difficult circumstances.
Professor Elborn?
Well, again, we're devolved in terms of that education responsibility to Department of Economy, which didn't have a minister, so we dealt primarily with senior civil servants around keeping them informed and made that autonomous decision with our governing body in terms of the resolution that we agreed with UCU.
Thank you. I'll bring in Vicky.
Thank you. I've got two questions. Firstly, if you allow me, Chair, there have been stories in the press recently about the applications to UK universities from overseas students plummeting to the extent that some UK universities may even face bankruptcy. Now, I realise there can be lots of causes, and some of that might be the economy in some of those countries. But is it fair to say that the chaos of last year's industrial action will have caused reputational damage in some countries, and maybe a reason why some students might be thinking twice about applying to UK universities now? Karen, you were...
Yes, that's a very interesting question. Our international student applications are holding up extremely well this year. Durham is a very popular university with international students, and the sorts of areas where we tend to get students from, so for example, we don't get many students from Nigeria, where the economic woes of Nigeria are clearly having a very big impact on the numbers of Nigerian students who are applying to come to the UK at the moment. So we're not seeing any of those effects. Nevertheless, I was concerned about our international reputation. What would people say in countries where these kinds of industrial actions are quite unusual, quite hard to explain, or you have different educational systems? So we were very in close touch with our offices in India and our offices in China, trying to gauge public opinion. I think we didn't see any very dramatic effects, but I think it's inevitable that some families, when considering where to send their children, will wonder about UK versus Canada versus Australia. So nothing dramatic, but I think it is important that we collectively husband the reputation of UKHE and we continue to convey that message about the quality and standards of what we do and the quality of the education we provide, because we believe it's excellent, but undoubtedly that is something we have been thinking about.
Yeah, Adam.
Our international numbers also, applications also are strong. I was in India 2 weeks ago, and the question that came up about, from prospective applicants and their families, interestingly, was not about industrial action. It was about whether the UK is a hospitable place for international students, and I absolutely reassured them that it was, because I genuinely believe that. But certainly the pressures of living in London, they're very cognizant of the huge demonstrations in the city that are taking place, and so concerns about security, about the financial costs of a UK education, I think they are paramount. Of course, the industrial action wasn't good news for the sector. It didn't help, but I have not actually heard anybody mention that at any point.
I'm aware I'm on borrowed time, but I'd love to hear from Queen's.
Yeah, I would reflect similar responses. I think our experience has been that for the students and their families, it's the quality and the integrity of the degree that they come to the UK sector to get is really important. And I think one of the things that we did quite well across the sector was to really protect the quality of the education that we were delivering and the assessment for the award of a final degree. I'm a bit concerned about just a number of things that accumulate in the UK in terms of attracting international students here, and I think we as a nation need to be careful that we look after the important HE sector that we have and its impact across those international boundaries, which I think are...
This is something the committee will come back to if
we may come back to. I don't think you're just important. I think you're a jewel in the crown. Okay, yeah. So the majority of students, the young people, they will have worked hard for a number of years. They've paid a significant amount of money. They've taken on considerable debts, and their degree is often vital for them to move on to the next stage in their lives. So many young people I've spoken to have said that at a minimum, they would expect to have their degrees marked and their work marked. And they would like to see minimum service standards. But when we met the unions, perhaps not unsurprisingly, they didn't want to have minimum service standards. So I would like to know what your views are. I'm going to start with Adam and then Stuart and then Karen, just to go the other way around.
So I think it's a very interesting question you pose. I'm concerned about minimum standards because I don't know what minimum standard would actually be an acceptable standard. I agree with you about marking, and we were fortunate we were able to mark all of the work. The vast majority of work was marked and all students graduated. I pick up on Karen's point about perhaps more that the OFS can do to help us with ensuring that our regulations are structured in such a way across the sector that allow us to respond. But actually, if we set a minimum standard, I think the risk is that what are we taking out? If it's just marking of work, it's the feedback, it's the additional learning environments that over the 5 years of industrial action, during
minimum to get the degree that allows them to get the job,
yes,
and move on in a timely way to the next stage of their lives.
Absolutely, I'm not denying that is essential. We were in a position to deliver that. We were successful in doing that. What I'm saying is, I think we need to be very careful that where we set that bar, because if it's about lost learning, even we don't accept partial performance of staff, and we need a degree is more than simply the hours spent in a lecture hall or the assessment that you deliver.
Thank you. Stuart?
Yeah, I think we must do what is needed to ensure we maintain the quality and integrity of the degrees that we're awarding and the education that surrounds that. And for me, the best way to do that is through consensus. And it's important that we have unions who will engage with us. And I think we've got to find a consensus conclusion to this so that students don't ever have to go through this process again.
Just briefly.
Equal sides. And we need the students.
Would you, in your words about the importance of quality and integrity, would you agree that for many students last year they felt the quality and integrity of what they were being offered was not achieved?
I think for the majority of students, because the sector worked so hard to fix this, that we maintained that quality. And I think my colleagues would agree with that.
Not for all. Anyway, Karen.
Thank you. So just to follow on from what Stuart said, I think one has to distinguish between the quality of the experience, and we know that students had over the last few years, and I include my own 2 children, varied experiences of higher education in terms of days of strikes, but quality of the degree standards, that's very, very important, because that is the piece of paper that you take away with you for life. And I think you've heard from us and from others that we were very focused on maintaining that aspect of quality. In terms of minimum service levels, I think we'd need to see what that looks like. I think there is, for us as a sector, and we're seeing this with some very high-profile legal cases at the moment, a lack of clarity about consumer protection law for students. I do hope that clarifies. I mentioned earlier the OFS. I think possibly as an alternative, a clearer role for the OFS in this particular regulatory space would not be unwelcome. It is a legitimate expectation that a student embarks on a degree expecting that they will have their work marked and assessed within a reasonable period, and that period is actually not specified in regulations across the sector. So there are various ways of doing it, but my preference would be, we have a regulator, we need to work well with the regulator of the sector, and clearly, as Stuart says, we need to work well in terms of our industrial relations. I think we would all accept there's a lot more we need to do as a sector in terms of our industrial relations, understanding the world we're in, the financial constraints we're under, and the aspirations of our staff. So there's a bigger piece around this, but be interested to see what the proposals look like.
Not to know.
I'm going to close the session there because we've got the Minister waiting, but thank you all for your evidence this morning.
Suspended. The proceeding is currently 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 suspended.
It's a pleasure to be back at the Select Committee. So we took, first of all, you were right to say that universities are autonomous. So just as if, I'm sure it would never happen, the clerks decided to go on strike and not provide the committee with any briefings, the leader of the House may make her opinion known, as might the Speaker, but I don't think, as far as I understand it, they have any direct intervention powers to change that. It's the same way with our relationship with universities. We don't have direct powers to say you must mark students' papers or you must not have industrial action or whatever it may be. Having said that, we did everything that was possible in the levers or the instruments that we had available. So that involved me having a number of meetings with the university bodies, particularly UUK, and the Russell Group and other university mission groups in June
discussions in July. I was very grateful to have regular discussions with UUK and Vivian Stern, who kept me updated on on a very, very regular basis. We met with the universities to find out what they were doing, to find out what the mitigation factors they were taking, and to apply moral pressure as much as we possibly could. Secondly, where we could intervene, we did. So, for example, we negotiated with the Home Office, as you are aware, to ensure that international students were given exemptions in terms of those who wanted to progress to a graduate work visa. We worked with the teacher training bodies to make sure that no students were disadvantaged. We had the civil service fast stream. We made sure that we did all we could to ensure that students who were not able to access the civil service fast stream. I wrote letters to the university making it clear what we felt their responsibilities were, both in June and in August. We also wrote to the Office for Students as well. I had some individual discussions with some Vice-Chancellors. So I did everything as a minister and the officials as a department, everything possible we could do to try and intervene and try and ensure that students weren't, too many students weren't negatively affected by the marking assessment boycott.
Minister, just in terms of the role of the Office of Students in this, we hear a lot from universities that they are sometimes concerned about this as a new regulator. I mean, it was interesting listening to the last panel that actually there was an agreement from those who were regulated by the Office of Students that there could be a role for the Office of Students here in terms of clarifying the importance of getting the regulations right so they can respond to a situation like this. Is that a conversation you've had with the Office for Students in terms of what can be learned from recent events and how they can ensure that they are playing that role with universities?
Well, so we have regular conversations with the OFS. It is important to note that the OFS did issue guidance at the time to students. They also wrote to students. We wrote to the Officer for Students as well at that time. It's important to note the OFS has a number of interventions that it can do. First of all, it can intervene if it feels that universities aren't meeting their registration conditions. But also, given that the Competition and Market Authority also issued guidance about consumer law in terms of universities.
Which you've just heard is rather unclear.
Well, the Office for Students, for example, trading standards say that universities are not meeting their obligations, the Office for Students can also ask trading standards to investigate.
Have they ever done
that? Not that I'm, as far as I'm aware, but as I say, this was quite a new development, and my hope is that lessons will be learned. And if there is clarity, I don't control what the CMA do, I don't control the investigatory bodies or the regulatory bodies, but my hope is that if this happens again, people will know perhaps respond in slightly different ways.
And when you were intervening and having those conversations, you mentioned the UCU, presumably you engaged with UCEA as well as the...
Engaged with UCEA, yes.
Yeah. How satisfied were you with their responses to that engagement?
Well, they're an independent body. They were there to negotiate on behalf of those universities who were part of their member bodies, part of their membership. They carried out surveys which were helpful, which I'm sure, had detail of. I have some details here. That was helpful to us to find out exactly what was going on. Not every university replied, but I think about 120 did. UCEA suggested, I think, around 6% of final year students were affected by the marking assessment boycott. I think UCEA have an important role.
And do you believe that all universities took appropriate action to mitigate the impact on students? We've heard about some of the mitigations that specific universities who are giving us evidence today took. What, in your view, was the best approach to mitigations? And are there any examples where you think more could and should have been done sooner?
I think the problem with that question is there's not a one-size-fits-all, and there's different courses, and universities responded in very different ways. So some universities had alternate markers. Some universities had slightly weakened the regulations, like having less people on exam panels. Some people gave pre-assessed grades or preliminary grades. Some people just gave them grades based on their past performance.
I mean, isn't it quite striking, though? We've been hearing about the importance of supporting widening participation cohorts. It's quite striking that some of the highest profile universities in the country seem to have had some of the biggest problems here when it comes to people not receiving their degrees on time. Is that because they set more rigorous standards, or is it actually because perhaps they had older regulations which were less adaptable to the situation?
Well, there is suggestion that some universities, and I think you've heard that evidence, had regulations which made it difficult to adapt. Some of it will have depended on the courses, because, for example, some universities may have been better able to get external markers, but there were some courses that it was much harder to find external markers. It is worth mentioning that in many universities where this was going on, the staff who did not take industrial action, there were a number of staff who were actually marking the papers, taking on extra burden, and I think I pay tribute to those staff and thank them for doing so, because they took on an enormous burden at a very difficult time, and it may have been the case some universities didn't have that, weren't able to use that resource. Also, some universities have higher union representation than others. So unfortunately,
subjects as well.
And subjects. Yeah. I mentioned that some subjects that you can find alternate markers, some you can't. So I think that is why you had such a disparate response to it. Having said that, given what has gone on, and I do think if this happens in the future, I'm very hopeful that it won't happen this year. I said hopeful. But I do think that I hope that those universities who are affected the most will have learned from this and have a serious contingency planning in place to make sure it doesn't happen again.
And I'll bring in Flick on that point.
Thank you. I mean, the government put in a number of mitigations in place to support students, including flexibility on visa requirements and entry requirements for civil service fast stream, although, of course, one of our colleagues' daughters missed that one. You've probably heard about that. And international teacher training applications. And do you have any figures on how many students benefited from these changes and what impact it had?
So the teacher training was very low. I don't have the exact figures, but we know it was very low. In terms of the fast stream, we've asked the Cabinet Office for that information. We haven't yet been given it, but as soon as we get it, we will contact the committee with that information. The Home Office didn't assess the numbers in terms of international students, so we don't have that information from the Home Office. And of course, it was a discretionary arrangement with the international students, not necessarily concessionary. But so I would want to give you, if I was able to give you those figures, I would of course supply them.
Okay, because we heard earlier on from the panellists that there was mitigations for the visa, particularly in the visa, and they were talking to the Home Office to arrange those too. So there must be some sort of figures.
Well, it may. We've been advised that the Home Office didn't collate these figures, but it may be that the committee wants to contact the Home Office directly, and we're very happy to continue that work.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, how were the measures of these mitigation measures communicated to the students? And are you aware of any students who are unable to make use of these measures due to lack of awareness? Was there any discussion about financial compensation as well?
Yeah, so I mentioned that the OFS communicated to students, but there was also the Office for Independent Adjudication, and that is a very important body, but again independent. We are not, because it's independent, we are not given information by the OIA in terms of individual cases, but they set out guidance to students how to, what the complaints procedure was, and the way it works is the student first has to complain to the university, and then a bit like going to an ombudsman, as every MP will know, and then work through the Office for Independent Adjudication. So you had the OFS and you had the OIA that set out clear guidance to students about what their rights were. The Competition Markets Authority also set out what the consumer guidelines were for universities at the time. I think that possibly some universities might have been better at communicating than others, but again, I don't want to point fingers at individual universities. But the crucial point, and that's what the purpose of this committee inquiry, I hope what you're doing and what went on will ensure that those universities who are worst affected are better prepared for such an event in the future.
Okay, and has the government ever considered talking about financial compensation? I mean, from the universities, not obviously from the...
We can't, because universities are autonomous.
Okay.
So just as I couldn't get the committee to get financial compensation, God forbid if the clerks decided to go on, take industrial action. I'm not saying this would ever happen. I'm just going to give a metaphorical example. But okay. That is the job of the whole reason why the Office of Independent Adjudicator was set up. They decide what compensation, they decide the fines and so on.
I just follow up that though. What visibility does the Office for Students have over those issues? We heard earlier from Durham about the £500 acknowledgement payments, which are not compensation, but also that there were a number of cases where compensation was paid. Does the OFS or the department have proper oversight of how the universities spend their money in that regard, or is that fully at the discretion of the universities?
And that is, I mean, Patrick might correct me if I'm wrong, but this is, universities are autonomous. That is the discretion of the universities, how they decide to spend their money. But obviously, they have to make sure that they fulfil their registration conditions, and that's what the office is there for them to do.
Yes, and just to support the Minister on that, so we do have oversight over the activity of the Office for Independent Adjudicator. So, for example, in 2022, it heard 28,000 complaints and made recommendations for about £1 million worth of compensation. What we don't get involved in is the individual casework, as you'd expect. Similarly with the Office for Students, so the Office for Students, as you know, operates a risk-based approach, and where they have concerns about a provider, they have the ability to investigate that provider and its whether or not it's meeting its conditions of registration, which include, as the Minister said, compliance with consumer law.
So the Office for Students can't get involved with individual complaints. However, it is perfectly right for students to make the case to the OFS that the university as a whole is not meeting certain registration conditions, and it's up to the OFS whether they decide to look into it or not, but they can't get involved in individual cases. That's the job for the Office for Independent Adjudication. Mohammed. Oh, sorry, Anna, you're coming on this one, aren't you?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Minister, and understand exactly what you're saying about universities being autonomous. But we've heard quite a gap between the rhetoric from the universities and the reality for some students. The universities have told us of differing methods of communication and all sorts of ways in which they've tried to communicate with students about the marking problems, email, QR codes, the lot. But we've heard from students, and of course you've got to be difficult going from the individual to the general, but we've heard from students about sort of a lack of communication. So as Government Minister for Higher Education, I'd be interested to know, is that inconsistent picture something which you have heard as well? And as the Minister, is that something which concerns you, and which going forward you would like to see, more consistency around communication? And have you considered perhaps convening a round table or something of that nature?
Yes, I think that's a very fair point, and I do have lots of round tables with university organisations, the trade bodies. I meet with Vice-Chancellors directly. I go to visit universities regularly. We did have round tables at the time, as I've mentioned, with the university bodies and university mission groups. I absolutely want consistency, not just in communication, but also in terms of good completion, progression, and outcomes, and that lies behind some of our higher education reforms. So absolutely, universities should have consistency of good communication to their students, and there will absolutely be variation. These are things that the regulatory bodies need to look at, and I, as the Higher Education Minister, can bring moral pressure to bear, and I will continue to do so to make sure that that is the case, and also to make sure that if we see this again, that universities will be much better prepared.
Exactly. It's particularly around, isn't it, making sure we learn the lessons and...
Absolutely. And that, of course, hopefully, with the recommendations of this inquiry, it will make a huge difference in terms of advising universities on what should be done.
Thank you. Looking now at the minimum service level consultation in education that the department carried out and is now closed, it sets out detailed proposals for schools and colleges, but only asks initial questions on the impact of strikes in higher education. You have covered this already to some extent, but there might be things you want to add about why you took that approach to higher education, and do you propose to set out any more detailed proposals in future?
So it's very important when comparing universities, MSL in universities or MSL in schools, we literally are comparing apples with pears, because the autonomous nature of universities, independent universities, is a very different kettle of fish. And what we're trying to do with the minimum service levels in terms of higher education, it was part of our consultation, if I can just set those key things. What is the impact? Should you be focusing MSLs on students in key exam years or in final years? Should you be focusing on students doing critical subjects that are absolutely essential for our nation's skills needs, like nursing, for example? Should you be focusing on students with the correct amount of contact hours? So there are different parts of the consultation. The consultation finished at the end of January. We are literally considering the response. The whole purpose of the consultation was to try and understand in more detail about what exactly had gone on, how the students were affected, and where we should focus in MSL if we do. It may be that we need to further consult on it, but I can't, we're not in a position, because it's being considered at the moment, to give you any further details, even though I would love to be able to do so. We've got to get it right. This is a very complex area. We've got to make sure that we get it right, and the consultation literally only just finished not so long ago, a few weeks ago.
Thank you. I won't push you further on that then. Obviously, as consumers, university students, have the rights under contract law, and if a degree hasn't been marked, and that leads them to lose a job opportunity, could easily be argued that is a fundamental breach of performance of that contract, and compensation in accordance with the law should follow. But do you think that students have enough knowledge about their rights as a consumer and the remedies that might be available to them through the law?
So I mentioned that if that is the case, that happened, and we know roughly from surveys around 6% of final year students were affected one way or the other. Many of them would have got their grades, but we know they were affected by the marketing assessment boycott. They must complain through the university and then go for the Office of Independent Adjudicators. That will decide whether or not the university has breached their conditions in terms of providing a proper service to students, whether it's consumer law or anything else. So I think it's very important that things are decided by the independent adjudicator. where I have some sympathy for what you say, I do think there's also needs for greater transparency. So, for example, online learning. I love Open University. I think I've described it as one of the greatest education reforms of the last century, and I watched it on TV as a child, and it is incredible, and they help those that are the most disadvantaged climb up the ladder of opportunity. But you know what you're getting. You know what you're getting. If you are going to a university for a face-to-face experience, you should be able to make sure that you are getting that experience, or at least know before you apply how much is going to be based online, how much is...
of course, Open University is a lot cheaper.
And a lot cheaper, and incredible value for money, and genuinely an amazing institution. I have to say, it's possibly one of my favourite universities, one of my favourite. Absolutely, there does need to be more transparency. When students apply to university, they need to know exactly how much online learning there's going to be, how much face-to-face learning. And I think, again, this is up to universities, but I can, as a minister, apply some moral pressure to make sure that students absolutely know that what their rights are, what they expect, what are they expecting from their education. And I think that there is a role for the OFS in that. The regulatory bodies is also a role for universities. But I think it's really the responsibility of universities on their websites when people apply. And they go through you because they know exactly what they're signing up to.
Thank you, Minister.
Mohammed?
Thank you. NUS survey revealed that over 3/4 of students at this supported strike actions. This committee heard from witnesses on 6th of February, and they have great concerns that minimum service levels would not work and would not address the fundamental issues behind the industrial action. So dispute around pay and working hours hasn't been resolved. What is your response to this?
So, look, there'll be different views from different students. Some students are, it's been clear from the newspapers, have been very unhappy about not having, understandably, not having their exams marked and the market assessment boycott. So, inevitably, there'll be different views amongst students, but the minimum service level, that's why we've consulted on it. I actually believe that education is a public service. I think that it is essential. I think that students, don't forget, they're investing a huge amount of money, £9,250 in terms of a loan. And if they're going to, it goes back to the question of Anna Firth, if they're going to be investing that money every year in a loan, they should be getting the service that they expect. And so I think we're absolutely right to consult on minimum service levels, to find out what the issues are, to find out how you can mitigate some industrial action if possible. But as I say, we haven't made any final decisions yet on this. We're still consulting on it.
Don't you think that if you push this further, more staff can leave the profession?
Well, it'll be interesting to see the evidence for that. I hope that isn't the case. As I say, we're consulting on the minimum service levels. I believe education is a public service. I believe that students who invest thousands of pounds by taking out a student loan, which they have to pay back throughout their working lives, I believe they should get the service that they've signed up to. I don't think that's an unreasonable. This isn't like going to buy a pizza. This is about their education, their whole livelihood, their future job security, and I don't think it's unreasonable to have a consultation on minimum service levels.
Andrew?
Thank you. So, Robert, you've talked about OFS already, so I just wanted to ask if you've got anything to add about what your assessment of OFS's performance was, whether there's anything they could have done better. And back in May 23, you told the House of Lords committee that you hadn't sent any guidance letters to OFS at that stage. And I just wondered why that was, as part of a sort of general assessment of OFS's added value, whether they could have done anything different or better, or whether you don't think this is their specific focus.
So I think that... first of all, the OFS, I didn't issue guidance because the OFS issued guidance. The OFS also sends a letter to students. I wrote to the Office for Students. I wrote to the universities twice as universities minister to try and push things along as much as I could. I think the OFS has a difficult role, which is a risk regulator. There is a review going on about the role of the OFS. No doubt I'm guessing that the Select Committee might have Sir David Bean to the committee at a future date because it's a very important review as to the effectiveness of the OFS. I think whether or not the OFS could be more agile or when there are issues that come up, that's a debate that will be worth having, absolutely. But though I think we did a lot with the OFS and with the universities, I didn't feel the need to issue a separate guidance letter. I also think it's very important that you do these things, these letters, that they work because they're not frequent, particular guidance type of letters. But we did everything we could to try and push things along.
Okay. Thank you, Chairman.
Caroline?
Thank you, Chair. Just on that committee, House of Lords Industry and Regulators Committee, there was evidence heard suggesting that the OFS could or should do more to clarify students' rights during industrial action. Do you agree with that? Do you recognise that as a very legitimate
I think that's a debate to be had, but I think I go back to the question of Anna Firth, that I think it should be the responsibilities of the universities, and then the OFS should look at whether or not universities are breaching their registration conditions. I think universities should be as transparent as possible, being very clear what student rights are, what they expect from their education, how much online learning they would have, what would happen in the event of industrial action, and I think transparency is absolutely the key, because if students know these things before they apply to each individual university, I think it will make that decision making of the student, they'll be much more informed before they go to the university and then end up being let down.
Understood. Is this perhaps part of the review that you cited into the OFS in terms of what the expectations are of its role? Was I think quite recently it was David, the Deputy Director, who said that they didn't feel the OFS should be the sort of one-stop shop for everything. Is their role understood by students or by the wider community?
The OFS was created in 2017 under the Act. It has, I think there is a debate to be had, and this is why we've done the review. So this review by Sir David Bayan will, is looking at the role of the OFS, looking at its effectiveness, and I can't answer though what the outcome of that review today, but I think there is a debate to be had. I think the OFS does some things well. I think it's difficult for a risk regulator. There are issues, for example, anti-Semitism that has come up recently at universities. Is the OFS able to respond immediately where there are instances of anti-Semitism if they believe that universities aren't dealing with it properly, for example? So this is a debate, and I think you're absolutely right. I think this issue has touched on that debate on the role of the Office for Students. But on the whole, I think the Office for Students is doing the right thing. I think it's a risk regulator. I think that we put a lot of things on the OFS over recent years. For example, freedom of speech, the mental health charter, which we're asking universities to sign up to. But I think these, people will continue to have that debate on whether or not the OFS is fit for purpose. I think on the whole it is.
So can you just give us any guidance on the timing of that review and when you expect that to report back?
Yeah, so I had a meeting with Sir David Bayan in terms of some of the things that he was looking at only a week or so ago. I don't know, Patrick, if you want to give about the time.
It's going to report in May, was our expectation, so it started just before Christmas and reported May.
Thank you.
And actually, he is. I wouldn't suggest for you who you ask for evidence, but I would definitely, if you have time in your sessions.
We have plenty in our programme, but I think it's certainly something we want to come back to after he's reported.
I think he'll have some very interesting things to say.
Mohammed.
Yeah, thank you. Given that the reasons for industrial action, especially dispute around pay and working conditions, have not been resolved, how likely it is, in your view, that industrial action can happen again?
Well, there was a ballot at the end of, end of September, October, and it didn't reach the 50% threshold. So I'm hopeful that industrial action will not be occurring across our universities this summer, and I'm hopeful that we won't have a marking assessment boycott this summer.
You're hopeful, or you're confident?
Well, the ballot didn't reach the 50% threshold to partake, the union ballot, so I'm not expecting industrial action.
If it happens again, what action department can take to minimize the impact on students as much as possible?
Well, first of all, as I mentioned to some of the previous questions, I hope that universities will have done a lot more contingency planning, so because they now know the effect on students. I do think that by the way, one student not getting their marks is wrong, is terrible. It's very, but you also need to put this into perspective, that it was 6% of students in final years. Now that is absolutely still really terrible for those 6%, but you do need to put it into perspective. But nevertheless, I'm hoping that universities are doing the right contingency planning and putting the mitigation factors they need in place. I will be writing to universities, especially those particularly affected, to ask what that contingency planning is. I will continue to have discussions with the university sector. I know that the regulators, of course, are looking at these issues as well.
Thank you. And Melissa, you've also written to universities on some other issues recently. I know anti-Semitism on campus has been a particular concern of yours. You mentioned that in terms of the discussion of the OFS, and I think some issues have been drawn to my attention on that front, which are deeply concerning. Can you update the committee on what steps you've been taking to engage with the sector on that?
Yes, it is. If I could set the context, it has been pretty horrific. And by the way, anti-Semitism was going up across our universities well before October the 7th. This isn't just a result about the tragedy in the Middle East and the massacre of Jews and internationals on October the 7th. But since October the 7th, it's gone up well over 200%. I've been around the country, both myself and the Secretary of State, meeting with student groups, meeting with the Union of Jewish Students. I travelled to Leeds because of horrific incidents going on in Leeds in terms of intimidation of the Leeds University chaplain, the Jewish chaplain. I've held regular discussions with all the Jewish bodies connected with the university, whether it's Community Security Trust, the Jewish Chaplaincy Service for universities, which I have high regard for, and UJS. And so what we're doing is a number of things to try and deal with this. The first is that, as I mentioned, we're having regular consultation with Jewish groups. The Prime Minister announced a £7 million fund for schools and universities. I think just over 3.2 million, if I'm not mistaken, is going to the universities to help Jewish groups deal with anti-Semitism. We're also developing a quality seal for universities. I was talking about transparency earlier in terms of online learning and other things. A quality seal would be able, Jewish students would be able to see whether a university has a quality seal in terms of how it deals with anti-Semitism, how it deals with complaints, what it's doing to protect Jewish students as well. We're looking at the idea of an expert advisor as well on this issue. And I'll continue to do everything I can, but I think it is a major problem across our universities. I fear that there is ghettoisation going on.
And in terms of that, I mean, that's obviously not something we want.
Students unable to do what they should be doing, having the best time of their life at university. And
in terms of that fear of ghettoisation, that's something that we wouldn't want to see for any community, and clearly is not right. Does the department monitor the figures in terms of the number of people from different religions and different groups who are applying to universities in the UK, or the number who might be choosing to go elsewhere? Because I guess I've heard concerning evidence in some cases of people choosing to pursue an education in Israel because they feel that they wouldn't be comfortable doing so in the UK. Now, that's anecdotal. I don't have evidence of the numbers. But is that something that the department can look into in order to ensure we understand the inflows and outflows of students with different characteristics?
So first thing, I will ask Pat, if you don't mind, ask Pat just to give you the granular detail. I'm a half-glass full person rather than a half-glass empty person, and I'm reminded of a quote from Golda Meir, former Israeli Prime Minister, which is pessimism is a luxury that no Jew should allow himself. And so I still believe that this is a great country. I still believe that our universities are great places to go across England, or across the United Kingdom, in fact. And I hope very much that Jewish students will not feel that they can't go to our universities. And as a government, we're going to do everything possible to stamp out the cancer of anti-Semitism wherever we see it, and we're not prepared to tolerate it. But I'll ask Patrick about the figures.
And the short answer is we do obviously monitor the characteristics of those that apply to university and the trends and those over time. I don't know the answer to the specific question, but we can take that away and come back.
I mean, if you could write to us with a breakdown perhaps of different communities and the numbers, both in terms of applicants and people who sustain their degrees, that would be very interesting for the committee to see, I think, in terms of our wider work. And as I say, that could inform future work. I mean, the other area we've heard that this has an impact, of course, is on international students. And you'll be very familiar with some of the debates around international students, Minister. But I think we did hear in the last panel concerns around the scale of protests in London and concerns around security being of importance to international students. You've mentioned some of the funding that the government is putting in that respect. Is there anything else that we should be doing in these circumstances to reassure international students that the UK remains a safe and welcoming place for them to pursue their studies from wherever they're coming in the world?
I think we had a target of 600,000 international students. The previous figures that we have are 679,000 international students. I think international students are a good thing. I think that they bring soft power, but they also, without a doubt, they add an important source of income to universities. And I think we have to acknowledge that, given that we've decided as a government not to raise tuition fees. We know that international students are worth about £58 million per constituency and well over £30 billion in terms of our educational exports. Having said that, we've got to stamp out abuse where it occurs. So that's why we got rid of the dependency route for postgraduate students accepting for PhDs. That's why we've got the review of the Migration Advisory Committee in terms of the graduate route. And so I think we've also got an investigation going on in the department about which has been highlighted in the Sunday Times, where there is abuse by agencies in terms of how they bring international students, or whether or not they are somehow getting a sort of an easier escalator to get into British universities. So we have an investigation on that going on, because there has to be an absolutely fair level playing field. But I'm absolutely clear as Higher Education Minister, I'm proud of our international students. They bring benefits to our country. They are examples of soft power. We'll crack down on abuse where it occurs, but I think that is the message I've given out since I've been in post.
And very briefly, I mean, you've mentioned obviously the important financial benefits that they bring to universities. There's no doubt about that, and to both. Yeah. But actually, I mean, one thing that struck me looking at the department's supplementary estimates, you were making a very important announcement yesterday about apprenticeships, which I think this committee would broadly welcome. It was in line with one of our recommendations in our post-16 qualifications announcement. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think it was in the order of £20 million, was it?
It was 60 million.
60 million.
That comes on top of
even better.
It's on top of 50 million announced in the autumn statement.
So that was 60 million pounds. The debate we had last Thursday about the department's estimates and spending on SEND, we were welcoming investment in new specialist schools, hugely important, much needed across the country. That was 115 million pounds. The supplementary estimate for the department had an increase of around 20 billion for the student loan book, from taking total departmental spending from around 80 billion to around 100 billion. A number of colleagues have commented to me there is no direct benefit from that enormous amount of money that is being put in there in the way that you would see from those much smaller amounts being put into expanding apprenticeships or being expanded. It's a financial calculation which very few people beyond the Treasury will really understand that is driving that. Are you comfortable that that system of funding our universities, which can see that bigger swing in in-year investment, is that higher proportion of the Department for Education's budget?
Well, I think you have to, I think this is a very complex issue, and we're constantly looking at the student finance system. But we have to be fair to students and fair to the taxpayer. And I think if you look at the overall income of universities, so you've talked about the loan, but if you look at the overall income, the research budget, the international students, their own private income that they get for one reason or another, it's about £40.8 billion. I think that in the current circumstances, with the challenges that that the country faces, the economy faces, that is not no mean whack of money. Of course, there are financial challenges for universities. I'm under no illusions, although I'm glad that over 70% of our universities have surpluses. But nevertheless, there are some universities facing financial challenges, absolutely. But I think it's a fair system. I think there are major challenges facing our universities in years to come about what kind of university do we expect to have in 2030, 2040. I think there's big 5 things coming down the track. One is our own HE reforms, which in terms of the completion, continuation, progression. The second is, of course, the lifelong learning entitlement, because you're talking about the loan book, but once that comes through from 25, 26, 27, what that will mean is a lot of people won't necessarily stay at university for 3 years. They'll do short courses or modules of courses and move from institution from FE to HE to HE to HE to HE to FE and back again, potentially. But won't necessarily stay at a place for 3 years as they do now. Some will, but it will be very different. You have the degree apprenticeship model, over 200,000 since 2014. Again, major changes coming through. More and more people will do them. We put 40 million into that. And then, of course, you have the disruptor universities. And what I mean by that are the Dyson universities, where you have universities on campus. And, of course, you have the new tertiary institutes of technology. We've got 21 so far. And they are collaborations with FE, HE and business. But a lot of people will go there and do level 4, level 5s and degree apprenticeships and higher apprenticeships. So the university that we have today, which is not that much different from when I was at university, apart from the fact I got most of mine paid for, whereas nowadays people have to take out loans. But the university system, but it hasn't really changed hugely compared to when I was at university. But the university system in 10 years' time, I think, will be very different. And I think it's beholden on whether it's the education committees, the university sector and others to work out what kind of university system we expect for the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years, how it's going to change, and it's going to be big. I missed out AI, of course, and the fourth industrial revolution. It's going to have a massive impact. How it's going to change, and then work out how it's going to be paid for.
Very long and very interesting answer. I could quibble about whether it's directly addressed the question of the financing costs of the loan book, but I think we'll leave it there, Minister. I'm very grateful for all you've done for the committee and for your evidence today.
Thank you.
Order.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.